Hello YouTube, this is Morgan Airspeed Prime here with my next Korra comic review. This is going to be my non-spoiler initial impressions on Legend of Korra Turf Wars Part 3. If you're wondering like how I've read it early, there was the Gallery Nucleus signing event thing that obviously a good amount of people went to, got their hands on Turf Wars Part 3 early through that signing with the creators, and someone has posted the pages online. Of course, I have ordered the book. It'll arrive when it arrives, but this just really helps me with being able to actually review the book on time. And what it does mean is that if you are looking for my spoiler review, that'll be out day the comic is out, guaranteed now, because I have read the book. But yeah, I'll keep this one spoiler free. That way, if you have read the book, you maybe will know what I'm alluding to. If you haven't, it'll maybe act as a little bit of a teaser to get you hyped for the book. But overall, how was Turf Wars Part 3? You'll know if you've listened to any of my preview content for Turf Wars Part 3 that I haven't been overly excited for it. I definitely said that it was a book that had a lot to do to really turn me around on Turf Wars. In that, I would say that prior to this, I thought that Turf Wars Part 1 was a fairly okay book. I think it was actually decent. Turf Wars Part 2 was a fairly weak book, definitely just extremely average. I'd say this is closer to Part 1 than it is to Part 2, so I think it is a better book. I don't think it fully saves Turf Wars, in that I still would say Turf Wars is an overall relatively weak story. I think it's far and away the weakest of all of the Avatar comics we've got so far. I know a lot of people would say The Promise, but to me The Promise comes across as being 10 times more eventful than this book, and I can't bring myself to criticize The Promise enough to make Turf Wars go ahead of it. I think purely because of I think so much that happens in The Promise is so much more interesting than what happens here. That's my biggest issue with Turf Wars, is just that I think if you're not the biggest Korrasami fan, if you just are like, okay, fine, they're a couple now, but I really, really care about the plot. That's why I'm reading these books primarily. I'm not reading these books just for Korrasami stuff. You know, if you are one of those people, you'll probably get everything that you want out of Turf Wars, and Part 3 will give you, I suppose, the last section of that, in that there are some nice Korrasami bits right at the end. Of course, I don't think anyone expected them to not end this series on a really nice, kind of cute, impactful moment for their relationship, and that's what they absolutely do. I won't spoil what it is, but it's nicely done, and even as me, who's fairly okay, fine, the relationship's cool. It's not one of my favorite ships or anything like that, but I thought it was actually pretty well done by the end of this. And if I had any issue with Korrasami, it's that I think it's for the most part now set up. It's set up fine. We can get behind it. It's, they've developed it as a relationship. My only real complaint remains that I feel Asami herself as an individual character isn't particularly strong, and so the relationship feels like entirely propped up by Korra and how well developed she is, and that sort of becomes a little bit of a problem in this book as well, in that Asami actually gets a decent amount of screen time. They show her being captured and who she interacts with, and in her side of the story. Of course, in Part 2 she was kidnapped, and we see who she's with. I don't think it's too much of a spoiler to say is Won-Young-Koom. He was also basically, Tokuga took over his company and stuff like that, betrayed him, so those two end up having conversations. We got previously established in the series that they have a little bit of history together, primarily Koom and Hiroshi. And I think it suffers from the exact same problem that Asami suffers from overall, and that is that too much of her arc or stuff that she ends up involved with is ultimately just kind of legacy stuff related to her father. And once again, that is more or less what comes up here, is that yes, she gets to use some of her skills, like her engineering skills, inventing skills, and so on. Very capable. She gets a little bit of an action scene. But when it comes down to her plot involvement in all of this, it is her talking to Won-Young-Koom about her father primarily. And, they try and bring it around, she's the businesswoman now, and that's fine come the end. It's just, can we focus on her? Like, I get her father's important to her, and that's a fine trait to have to develop the character, but it's now, I think, time, now that she's in the relationship with Korra, because of that, she's almost elevated to being an even more important character than she almost was in the series, because she's with Korra, and Korra is going to be the main character for all of the books, basically. I feel we need to get more on her personally. And I'll definitely, when it comes to this part of the discussion, refer you to watch my Asami character discussion video. I think I basically call it like Developing Asami. I'll link it in the description, and you can watch that to see, basically, I go through all 4 of the books, Asami, and how they use her character, the weaknesses, and what they can do to improve her going forward. So I think they use her okay here. It's definitely capable, but it's not development, and I think development is absolutely what she needs as a character. Going back to my main issue with the book, it's definitely that the plot, most of the plot, what actually is going on, the fact that the book is called Turf Wars means that the main plot is about, Tokuga, the new triple threats that are more powerful, trying to take over the city. That plot, I think, is just very, very weak. It's not particularly exciting, and the only, in any way, benefit it has is the fact that Tokuga is half human, half spirit. But they don't even use that all that well. It's just a power-up for Tokuga to make him a somewhat threatening villain. It's still just the triads primarily when you really break it down. And while it adds drama to a book that is obviously centered around, the new relationship of Korra and Asami, and he kidnapped Asami, that's really all he has going for it. That's, I think, Tokuga's only real strength as a villain, is that he immediately was able to target Asami to basically neuter Korra for most of the book in terms of what she was actually able to do. Other than that, I really feel that Tokuga is a very, very weak villain. I don't find him to be that interesting at all, in part because they never, I think, went as in-depth as they needed to go with what it means to be half human, half spirit. Because even them saying that kind of feels weird, in that, like, I don't really interpret him as necessarily being half and half. I more interpret him as being a human who has sort of been altered by a spirit, as opposed to half spirit. Because I think when you say half and half, it suggests something that he's kind of not as such. But again, that's where they were a little overly vague, in that we've seen other characters like this, like Yao, when he was half human, half spirit, under this same logic, basically. But he seemed weaker because of that. It seemed like that he got no benefit out of that, because he was like half tree, so he was kind of weak to fire, and he couldn't actually get firebending because of that, and so on. Tokuga obviously is at least established to be somewhat capable prior to the shift, but I don't think there's any real development. It's just a new guy takes over the triple threats, and that's the plot. Obviously, there's more going on here, and that it relates to the Spirit Portal plot, which, gets the focus, of course, as expected. All of the action ends up revolving around the Spirit Portal. That's where we end up getting to, as, like, they sort of entwine the presidential race into all of this. And I think the one thing I'll give the book credit for is that it, at the very least, I think, resolves most of the plot points brought up by Turf Wars. And what I mean by that is that the book is fairly, like, contained, in that when we go forward, I don't think we're going to be, like, in the future having to, like, resolve a lot of Turf Wars plot points that were set up here. At least it resolves what it, for the most part, has set up. Not quite everything, and, the book hasn't directly, like, set up what its next arc is going to be about. But I feel we're kind of through whatever this is. Whatever Turf Wars has been, we're sort of through, and we can deal with something new now, which is absolutely, I think, what they need to do. But, before I talk about some rough ideas about what I feel they need to do going forward, other characters, I suppose. Korra, of course, gets a lot of the focus here, because of course she wants to get Asami back, and you have a lot of characters kind of helping her through this. without spoiling it, the details of the scene, we do get the Mako scene I was sort of looking for. Not exactly the way I had sort of like wanted it to go, but more or less it accomplishes the core of what I wanted them to do with the Mako and his relationship with Korra and Asami, in that thankfully they've diffused any sort of weirdness around it, and it's like, yes, Mako, you know that was actually a really well written scene, and it feels like finally Mako can just kind of be on back to normal as a character, and we can potentially use him as a notable character in one of the books going forward, give him an arc, and so on. So that's something I'll praise the book for. That scene at the very least was well done. The presidential race, Julie and Raiko, it's interesting the way this book chose to do it, in that I think it's ultimately, they made the best choice I think they could have with this plot here, in that they didn't overly extend it more than it needed to, while still giving some resolution here, but also potentially set up for something going forward. But, you know, getting a resolution and it going, I think, basically the way it was completely set up, which feels a bit weird for Raiko as a character, because he just feels like he's in this weird vacuum position where borderline we might not see him again, or something like that, or he could be used even more going forward. But I think they did it well without making it like a huge plot point, without having like that suddenly become the main plot point and all the twists and turns happen there. I think they did it fine. And some of the little like little interactions between characters were done well here, in that from the preview pages we obviously saw Iroh having to be the one to sort of corral the airbenders, and he obviously doesn't want to do anything overly aggressive towards them, but Raiko is sort of forcing him to. And you know, Iroh gets, it's only I think like 2 or 3 scenes in the book, but I think they tell a little bit of an arc of just him sort of like, in a way, having enough of Raiko's kind of poor decision making, and choosing a side without, I suppose, going completely under Raiko's kind of underneath what Raiko actually said. But you know, somewhat well done there to accomplish what they needed to. Mako and Bolin, like, they're in the book, but I wouldn't exactly say they're focused characters. They're there to kind of just be backup for Korra primarily and help her. Bolin especially, I think, feels a little too much of a sidekick character at this point in time, so the decision that they make with him at the end of the book I think works out very well for him. And it was something I think myself and Greg brought up in one of the more recent podcasts, of just like, it was cool initially to see Bolin placed as like Mako's sidekick on the police force, but like 2 books in, just after part 2, it definitely felt like they don't really have any direction for him. The police force is Mako's kind of thing, it's his plot. Suddenly adding Bolin in here, I feel adds very little to Bolin, while also taking a little bit away from Mako. So it was I think it was ultimately a net negative thing overall, but I think they got some nice moments out of it early on. Like, at least while Mako's injured, having Bolin back him up for this story is fine. I'm a little still worried about the whole Mako's injured thing, because there's like a line of dialogue here that was a little concerning for me, and them not giving a massive... They weren't like overly like serious about it, like, oh, he'll never recover, but they also weren't like obviously like, oh, you'll recover in time, or like he's fully back and ready by the end of the book. I really hope that we can just move past the injury, and it's not just Mako's in a cast like for the next like 3 or 4 comic series or something like that. But yeah, Bolin, it seems like they're kind of going to push him in a different direction once they decide to give him a focus, which I appreciate. And I think that will benefit both characters. It'll give Mako and the police force room to have a more unique kind of police-focused arcs, and we can see where they properly want to place Bolin post-book 4. Some slight weaknesses again were just, I feel these books have been relatively poor at, I suppose, little fan servicey like moments, And what I mean by that is primarily just other relationships. Like we still, as of the end of this book, don't really see Bolin and Opal interact, even though they're in a relationship. Jinora and Kai, again, like, don't really see them interact. Though I think they're in the same scenes together a couple of times, but there's no real like interaction between the two of them. To just kind of, you know, give us that little update on some of the couples that we actually have going. They don't really do that. And in a book where you focus so much on one relationship, it feels weird that the other ones are basically ignored when they were like set up before Korrasami. So you know, I get what the focus of the book is, but not inserting little moments like that into the background are a bit concerning. And especially with Ironco's history of like negativity towards especially the Jinora and Kai relationship, I'm kind of wondering like is that the reason we didn't see any of that in the book? Or was it just that Mike didn't actually write any of it in? But you know, that's just speculation. I don't really know for sure if there's any of that at play. The art, I suppose, is one thing that we can talk about as well. You know, getting close to the end here. I found it to be much better actually than part 1 and part 2. I think she's gotten much more consistent with just the character designs, the faces being on point. I didn't really have too much issues at all with the art. I would say like overall it's not my favorite art style for books, but I usually, like for part 1 and part 2 when I first read them, there were moments when I stopped and was just like, whoa, the art isn't great there. This one, I didn't really have those moments. And again, part of that is because, you know, going off kind of slightly blurry kind of pictures, scans of the pages. Maybe that will stand out a bit more once I get the book and can look at the art a bit more clearer, cleanly. But, you know, it seems like she has improved. Would I want her to do more? You know, I wouldn't mind if they were doing like say a Korra, like a Lost Adventures, Team Avatar Tales, Korra edition. If they got Ironco on to do a short story in one of those books. But like to purposely like I think say that I want her to continue on with the comics when her scheduling and timing on stuff seems to be a major issue, I can't bring myself to do that. I don't think her art is that good that I think it's worth waiting basically double the amount of time between books. And I think if there's one thing that has affected Turf Wars really badly, it has been that the parts have been stretched apart so much that I think they have lost a little bit of the extreme hype they had around Turf Wars Part 1. And they probably could have got that back if it was 4 months between each book like it usually is. So that's always going to be something that I think does impact the book, but I think most people have stuck around for it, thankfully. And I think it will do well enough that they will definitely want to announce what's next for Korra Comics. Now, we don't know anything about if they are or are not going to continue. I think basically all we know is that Irene Coe realistically isn't going to be on board for the next comic. She's seemed to say that a bunch of times when she's talked about what she wants to do next. It seems like it's not working for any specific comic company, that if she is going to do something comic related, it's probably going to be her own kind of solo book that she, you know, does basically most of the work herself and then gets a smaller publisher to do, rather than kind of working for like a Dark Horse in this case or something like that. So I'd be very shocked if they announced that she's doing it. So that means that for another comic, they need to get another artist. And I would hope that they already have that done. And I hope they would already have had that done for months, because she said that since like, basically since she was announced, I think, a couple of months or weeks after that. She's been saying that, you know, she's only doing this and then moving on. So I hope they have that on track, because I think the worst thing they could do here after the success in terms of sales of Turf Wars, not necessarily in terms of the quality, would be to leave way too long between Turf Wars Part 3 and the first part of whatever's next. I think, I'm not saying rush it or anything like that, but, you know, if we don't know what's next for Korra Comics, I think, you know, by, let's say the end of January next year, by the time like Team Avatar Tales or so comes out and we still don't know what's next, like, that's sort of like a bit of like if you don't announce this very, very soon, like, you're going to lose people because you technically haven't said anything else about Korra Comics continuing. and that's my overall complaint with Avatar and Korra comics full stop, is the lack of like future direction and telling the fans what the future direction is, because especially with Avatar comics where we know that there's like a set end point, that we know like Republic City is founded, Korra happens at this point, there are end points for a lot of our characters in the Avatar comics. It feels weird that we have no direction for them. Korra comics are obviously much more open because there's nothing in the future that we know of that they necessarily need to hit, so they can do anything. So it leaves them more open, but because of that it also means that like, is there any guarantee that we actually will get any more? I think they have to, in that I think there are some very clear-cut ideas that they should do already. But yeah, in terms of final initial thoughts on Turf Wars, I think, yes, it's an improvement over Part 2. I think it's definitely fair to say that. It's a much better book than Part 2. It's probably on par with the first part, in that the first part I thought was overall relatively solid at setting everything up, but had like one or two moments that were just kind of like, ooh, I didn't like that you did that. I really didn't like your decision there. This one doesn't have as many moments that are like, I flat out didn't like this. There's probably only maybe one in the whole book, but it overall just, there was nothing overly substantial in that. I really think over the course of the book there were only maybe 3, 4, 5 at a stretch like notable scenes, and given that there weren't that many long scenes, it meant that the book didn't have that many great moments. I think it feels somewhat similar to North and South in the sense of like, given that the plot didn't end up really going all that many places in North and South, this feels similar to that, where, you know, there's a few standout scenes and they're the real takeaway from the book, compared to other comics like The Search, The Rift, The Promise, Smoke and Shadow, where a large parts of those books were really, really interesting character dynamics and so on. So that's where it kind of placed the book. I ultimately would say it wasn't the greatest idea to tell such a, I think, relatively dull story as the first post-book 4 story. And again, I think this is where it comes out. Like, it's going to be interesting to see how people overall compare Turf Wars to the first Avatar comic, which was The Promise. Personally, right now, I stand completely with the idea that, like, if you were going to say that Turf Wars is better than The Promise, like, one, have you read The Promise? Have you read Turf Wars? How on earth do you make that decision that The Promise is a weaker book than Turf Wars? I think The Promise is obviously, in my opinion, like, criminally underrated, and to say that this book is better, I think it's just kind of plain wrong, basically. But yeah, I overall would say it surpassed my expectations. It was better than I expected, and I went in fairly low. I still don't think it was that great, but I think it's you know, closer to good than I think it is to average. So it's somewhere in between there. Again, if you have to ask me to give it a score, it'd be like, you know, somewhere 6.5, maybe a 7. I need to reread it a couple of times and see some of the details I may have missed. But yeah, they're my initial thoughts on Turf Wars Part 3. In the comments, if you read the book, let me know what you think. But yeah, other than that, that's been the video. Full spoiler review where I'll talk about all the details will be on the 22nd, the Wednesday the book actually is released. Podcast will probably be, I think it's the week after that, because obviously we have no podcast today. We do have one next week, none the week after that, and then podcast. So it might be the week after that there is a podcast, but yeah, we'll do the in-depth, you know, page by page Turf Wars Part 3 spoiler podcast as soon as we can. But yeah, that's the stuff. So yeah, thanks for watching this video, and bye.